All right, so now we're going to move on to the next video, section unit 3D. And what we're going to talk about today are the opposites of an opposite. So if I tell you or ask you to find the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of -8, what does that equal to? All right, so that's all our learning objective is for this video, is to find the opposite of a number. So when we take the opposite twice, what will that value be? In the beginning, we are going to just touch on some of the things that we've done in the past. This is kind of as a review for this section. But then all we're going to do is just go over finding the opposite of a number. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is just go over again what the opposite of a number is. This is the first thing that we talk about in this. So it says locate the number 8 and its opposite on the number line. So our number 8 here is right this on our number line. And remember, if we want to find its opposite, well, 8 is 8 units away from 0. So that means we need to go 8 units in the other way away from 0 in order to find its opposite. And then that means that its opposite is going to be this number, -8. All right, so remember, when we're finding the opposite, it's the same distance away from 0 as your negative or positive counterpart, right? And we also have talked about when we have a -8, its opposite is going to be +8. If we have a 7, its opposite is going to be -7. It's just going to be the same number, but we're just changing its sign. And then it says, explain how they are related to 0. Well, in this case, they are the same distance away from 0. All right, so remember, our two opposites are the same distance away from 0, and then they will need to be on the opposite sides of 0 as well. All right, so there's a couple other things that we're going to brush up on before we start going over some more problems from today. So I wasn't going to go over this 1 or this 3, because by now you guys should be able to do that. But I'm going to go over it anyway, just very quickly. So remember, 90 feet below sea level, if we wanted to write it as an integer, well, when we're below sea level, we know that that means we're moving down from 0, which then means it's a negative number. So this will be represented by -90 for sea level. For this number 3, it says 2 degrees Celsius above 0. So remember, when we're above 0, we are a positive number. So we can write it as 2 or positive 2 or 2. All right. The reason why I want to go over one of these questions is mainly just for this debt. All right, $100 of debt. What does that mean? Well, when we're in debt, we owe somebody money. So if you borrow lunch money from someone today, $30, that means tomorrow you need to pay them $30. So when you are in debt, you're actually in negative. So that word debt is telling us that we are in minus, and then it will be -100. All right. So I wanted to go through these problems today, or these ones, just to specifically go over this, so that when you are in debt, you owe someone that money. So it's actually going to be a negative value. All right, so now we're going to go over a couple examples from what we were doing, or what our goal or objective is for today, and that's finding the opposite of a number. So if I ask you, what is the opposite of 8? Well, we already solved for the opposite of 8 earlier, but let's just do it again. So first, let's go ahead. I'm going to pause this video. I'm going to fill in all of the tick marks. All right, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to first find the opposite of 8. So if we were to write this out in words, it's kind of like we're finding the opposite, or as an abbreviation, of the opposite of 8. So the first thing that we're going to do is find this opposite of 8. So when I plot this point 8, we already talked about how to find the opposite. Remember, it's the same distance away from 0. So we know that this is 8 units away. And then when we go 8 units away in the other way, I know I'm just writing a squiggly line there, but we already did this in our first problem on this video. All right, so we know that the opposite of 8 is -8. So then this problem simplifies to finding, because we know that this is equivalent to -8. So now we're just left with finding the opposite of -8. Well, when we want to find the opposite of -8, well, this is 8 units away from 0. So then we just go to the other problem, or the other way, that is also 8 units away. So it brings us right back to this point 8. So then the opposite of 8 is 8, because the opposite of -8 brought us back to this 8. So our final answer for this one, what is the opposite of 8, is 8 itself. All right, so let's do this next one. It says, what is the opposite of -5? So once again, I'm going to write this out as the opposite of the opposite of -5. Right? So the first thing we're going to do is find this value here. So we have -5. Well, what is the opposite of -5? Well, we will count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units away from 0. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units away from 0. And the opposite direction is this +5. So then the opposite of -5 is equal to 5. And now we're left with finding the opposite of that 5. So once again, 5 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units away from 0. So in the other direction, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units away, it brings us right back to this -5. So then the opposite of 5 is -5. So the opposite of -5 is -5. All right, so we see in both of these examples, it brought us back to the original number. So the opposite of 8 was 8, and the opposite of -5 is -5. So we can then say that the opposite of a number is the original number. So we can think about this as these two opposites I'm going to highlight right here. When we're doing the opposite twice, they kind of undo each other because it's going to bring us right back to this starting point. So the opposite of the opposite, we know they're going to eventually cancel each other out, which brings us back to our original number. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to fill in this table. And I picked two numbers in particular because we have already done those. So we're going to go through it kind of quickly. But then by filling in this table, we're going to come up with kind of a rule or a formula that we can be using that we will tie into in our next video or the video after that so you guys can understand why we were doing this opposite of an opposite. All right, so first we have this number 8. We already solved what the opposite of the number 8 is. We know that the opposite of 8 is going to give me -8. So for this table here, I can just write in that the opposite of 8 was -8. And then we already solved again when we come back in this other direction. We know that the opposite of the number gives us our original. So I know that the opposite of the opposite is going to give me +8. Right, so then when I fill in this next one, we know that the opposite of -5, so 5 units away from -5 in the other direction, is also going to give me +5. And we know when we do the opposite of an opposite number, we start with our original, because if we were to count back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it brings us back to our original number, so we know it's going to be -5. Right, so then from here, we know that the opposite we can do the opposite of -2. Well, here's our -2. It is 2 units away from 0. So 2 units away in the other direction is +2. So we can then say +2. And then when we're finding the opposite of the opposite, 1, 2, 1, 2, or it brings us back to our original. Remember, the opposite of the opposite number brings us back to our original. And then the last one that we will do is this one here. Let me just erase this. Then the last one that we will be doing is this 4. So remember, our 4 is here. We are 1, 2, 3, 4 units away from 0. So 1, 2, 3, 4 units away from 0 in the other direction is -4. And then to go back to our opposite of the opposite, well, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. It brings us back to our original number. Let me change this color in case you guys cannot see this, but it gives us -4 and +4. All right, so what our goal is now is we are hoping that we can come up with some sort of formula or some sort of way to show these opposite of a number. So if we represent this number, let's just say A for any number, when we're dealing with the opposite of the number, we are simply just taking the negative of it. We're taking the opposite of it. We're moving in the opposite direction. So we're moving, so we can denote that by a negative. And when we are taking the opposite of an opposite number, we can then say it is the negative of -A. And these are things that are going to be very important when we are learning about these and tying them into subtracting a negative number. All right, so that kind of ties into here is write the opposite of -10 as an equation. Well, we're going to write it as an expression. It shouldn't say equation. It should say expression. And well, we know if we have -10, well, that is our number. So when we're taking the opposite of it, we need to take the negative because that's what it is here. It's the negative of our original number. And if we're taking the opposite of the opposite, we need to add one more negative. So we actually would add one more negative here, because this is our original number A, this is the opposite of A, and this is the opposite of the opposite. All right, so that is it for this video. Just make sure that you, if there are questions, depending on if we're going to do this individually or together as a class, if there's questions, just make sure you're answering the questions.